Welcome back, or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Carmen Fourie. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the director of Fourie Employment Relations. I've included a list of my credentials in the description box below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. Today's topic is overtime. I'm going to unpack overtime as it is stipulated in the basic conditions of employment. What that means is if your industry is regulated by a specific sectoral determination or a main agreement through a bargaining council, you can still watch this video and it might be of some value, but you will need to supplement the information from this video with the information that is in your sectoral determination or in your bargaining council main agreement or collective agreement. So if you want to look up where overtime is in the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, you will find it under Section 10. Overtime does not apply to all employees. There are certain employees that are excluded from the overtime clause. Before we can discuss the details of overtime, I just quickly want to discuss who overtime is not applicable to. So which employees are excluded from the overtime clause in the Basic Conditions of Employment. The first one is senior managers. Senior managers are not entitled to overtime pay unless, of course, discretionary, a company would like to give them overtime pay. Senior managers are defined as employees who can hire, appoint other employees, take disciplinary action, or dismiss other employees, and they are able to represent the company, be it internally or externally. The second exclusion is employees who work less than 24 hours in a month. So just a reminder, it's not 24 hours in a week, it's 24 hours in a month. The third exclusion is employees who are sales employees who regulate their own hours completely. So their hours are not dictated by the business. They decide when and if they work to meet their specific sales target. And finally, employees who earn above what we refer to as the earnings threshold will also be excluded from the clause of overtime as is stipulated in the Basic Conditions of Employment. Currently, the earnings threshold is set to 205,433 Rand and 30 cents per year. How to calculate the earnings threshold amount and what is included and excluded. So you'll take the employee's basic remuneration that they receive, but you will not factor in a travel allowance for this amount, or if the employee receives a subsistence allowance for when they travel for work and they have to stay over or cross borders and things like that. And also you won't include discretionary bonuses, or if an employee received a once-off type of payment as an incentive or a performance reward, that will also not be included in the calculation of the earnings threshold amount. And finally, overtime is not included in the earnings threshold amount. So basically it is somebody whose basic remuneration prior to deductions, but not counting in the travel allowance or overtime or subsistence allowance, is under 205,433 Rand and 30 cents per year. Any employee who earns above this amount, the particular clause of overtime, as is stated in the Basic Conditions of Employment, is not applicable to them. That means that they may be required to work additional hours, but they will not be entitled to overtime pay. So what is overtime and when does it become applicable? This may seem obvious, but I just quickly do want to explain it because I have sometimes seen it applied incorrectly in businesses. Overtime is any hours that are approved and instructed by management for employees to work up and above their ordinary hours of work. Ordinary hours of work are capped at a maximum of 45 hours per week as per the Basic Conditions of Employment. So if a company implements 45 ordinary hours of work per week, then all hours up and above that, as instructed by management, will be deemed overtime. However, sometimes employees work less hours as their ordinary hours. Some employees only work 40 hours as their ordinary hours per week. Then overtime will kick in as soon as the employee has completed those 40 hours, and overtime is then requested or instructed to be worked by management up and above what they usually work. So sometimes I hear people say overtime is all hours up and above 45 hours per week. That is incorrect for companies where employees do not ordinarily work 45 hours per week. That would only be correct if an employee is working 45 hours per week. Now let's get into the technicalities of overtime, and I'm going to work through Section 10 of the Basic Conditions of Employment. So the first and very important thing is that overtime can only be worked by agreement between an employer and an employee. If you would like to use my overtime agreement, in the link below, you can go to the website and for a small fee, you can download immediately my overtime agreement to use that specifically details everything in Section 10. Now, once you have the agreement in place, there is a limit to how much overtime an employee can work in a week, and this limit is 10 hours overtime in a week. We are still on the first part of Section 10, but I'm quickly going to jump to the final part of Section 10, which is subsection 6, which states that that cap of 10 hours per week can be extended by collective agreement. So a collective agreement is one where there is a union that represents employees and the union and the company agree to this. It can be extended from the 10 hours maximum per week to 15 hours maximum per week. However, that 5-hour extension can only be implemented for a maximum of 2 months in a 12-month period. So in absence of a collective agreement, overtime is capped at 10 hours per week. Sometimes designing shifts and ensuring that the working hours of employees complies with all the various sections of the basic conditions can be quite difficult. So just an important consideration when implementing overtime, it's capped at 10 hours per week. So consider that, plus the cap of 45 ordinary hours per week, and an employee can only work a total of 12 hours per day. So that would be the ordinary hours plus overtime cannot be more than 12 hours per day. That's stipulated in Section 10 of the Basic Conditions of Employment. However, also just look at Section 15, which regulates day and weekly rest periods, which will also indicate the maximum periods that employees can work without taking time off. Let's talk about payment for overtime. In the absence of a specific agreement, the ordinary way of paying overtime will be applicable. And that is to say that employees need to be paid 1.5 times their hourly rate for all overtime hours worked. Just to repeat that, that's 1.5 times their hourly rate for all overtime hours worked. There are 2 variations that can be applied, but only by agreement. The template that I have below does include these variations if you would like to implement them as well. So the first one is, instead of paying out 1.5 times the hourly rate, an employee will receive their ordinary hourly rate for that hour work, and then they will receive 30 minutes paid time off. The second one is going to sound very similar, but it is not the same. This is where an employee does not receive any pay for the overtime hours worked, but then they receive 90 minutes, i.e. an hour and a half off that is paid. So from a monetary perspective, from an employee side, it still comes down to 1.5 times their ordinary hourly rate. So the 3 options are pay out 1.5 times the hourly rate, pay their ordinary hourly rate, but then give them 30 minutes paid time off, or don't pay that hourly rate, but give them an hour and a half paid time off. How this plays out in practice, because it might be sounding a lot alike, and it might also be sounding like it is not beneficial at all to structure it differently. However, there are scenarios where it is. Let me give an example of how this is most commonly applied in practice. So let's say hypothetically on a Tuesday, employees are required to work an additional 2 hours after their ordinary hours of work has finished to meet a particular client deadline or a massive project. So option 1, the employer can just request that the next day they come in at their usual time, and at the end of the month they will get their basic remuneration, but then plus take those 2 hours times it by 1.5 and pay the additional overtime. However, sometimes it is more practical, not always, depending obviously on the workload and the specific circumstances, but what employers might do is that the employee on the Tuesday works those additional 2 hours, but then on the Wednesday, instead of coming in at their usual time, the employer says to the employees, you can come in 3 hours later, and those 3 hours will still be paid work. You just won't work on that particular day. So essentially, an employee's overtime pay becomes their paid time off the next day. This, however, does not need to be the next day. If the employer and the employee implement the agreement that we just spoke about, where they're given paid time off instead of receiving the overtime monetary amount, then that paid time off must be taken within a month of becoming entitled to it. However, again, and this is in my overtime agreement template, an employer and an employee can agree to extend that month for up to 12 months. In absence of a specific agreement that extends that period, an employer will need to grant that paid time off within a month. We're on the second last subsection of Section 10, and discussing overtime. I'm not going to discuss section 6 because we already covered it. That's where a collective agreement can extend the maximum number of overtime hours in a week from 10 to 15. And that can only be done for 2 months in a 12-month period. So okay, I said I wasn't going to discuss it and then I discussed it. So back to number 5, which is now our final part of discussing overtime. And this is one that is not very commonly known and also very seldomly implemented in practice. If an overtime agreement was implemented at commencement of service when an employee started employment or within the first 3 months of employment, that agreement actually lapses, meaning it falls away after a 12-month period, and a new overtime agreement would need to come about. So technically, after a year, it is advised that employees sign, although overtime does not need to be a specific written agreement, it is advised that employees sign a new overtime agreement after that first year. Thereafter, it doesn't lapse again. It's just that first year, if it was signed at the beginning of when they started working or within 3 months of starting to work. And that is everything that is detailed about overtime in section 10 of the basic conditions of employment. One of the questions that I get asked about overtime quite a lot, so I made a video specifically dedicated to answering that, is whether employers can force employees to work overtime. If you found this video helpful, please remember to like it, and if you'd like to see more of this type of content, remember to subscribe to my channel.